The day the denial letter landed in my mailbox, I was counting down 9 days until the solar crew pulled up to my driveway. The system was booked, the state rebate clock was ticking, and I had done everything the association asked me to do. The only open question in my mind was simple and brutal: could a last-minute, 30-day denial really crush a rebate deadline that had already ruled my entire spring? The late afternoon sun was bouncing off every identical beige garage door on my street, and I remember thinking how ironic it was that a neighborhood that bright hated solar panels this much. I had spent weeks pricing equipment, comparing proposals, and calculating how many kilowatt hours I could claw back from the utility. This was supposed to be the boring part, the paperwork, not the start of an HOA nightmare. When I first pulled the thin white envelope out of the mailbox, I assumed it was another generic newsletter. I saw the association logo, the tiny return address, the usual neat font they used for meeting notices. My brain did that automatic shrug it had learned after years of living under a homeowners association that loved paper as much as power. Then I saw the line under the windowed address that said Architectural Review Decision, and my stomach dropped. For context, I was not new to this board or their appetite for control. I had been in the neighborhood for 5 years. I had paid my dues on time, kept my lawn within the acceptable length range that was politely threatened in the covenants, and even moved a garden hose once because someone complained it was visible from the street. That is the kind of place I live in. The thing is, I was willing to play by the rules. I had read the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and I actually believed the part that said exterior changes would be approved as long as they were reasonable. I believed the line about energy-saving improvements being encouraged. That belief turned out to be very expensive optimism. What the board did not expect was that I was keeping receipts, literal and mental, from the moment I decided to go solar. To understand how we got to that envelope, you have to understand the board and our resident Karen. Our association is run by a 5-person board, but the real power sits with 2 people. The president, who I will call Ms. L, has the kind of smile that never reaches her eyes. She has lived on the main loop since the neighborhood was built and thinks of the association as her personal legacy project. The treasurer, Mr. D, is quieter but writes policy like he is balancing the budget of a small country. Then there is the self-appointed enforcer, the neighbor at the corner whose favorite hobby is spotting violations from her bay window. She is not on the board, but she attends every meeting, raises every minor issue, and treats the rulebook like scripture. I call her the corner Karen in my head, and she plays a bigger role as the story unfolds. Our rules are strict, but they are not vague. The covenants say any changes to the exterior of the home must be submitted for review. The architectural guidelines talk about rooflines, materials, and colors. Buried in the middle of that document is Guideline 12C, the section that deals with rooftop equipment. It says that mechanical equipment should be placed on rear roof planes when possible and screened from street view, but it does not outright ban anything. When our state announced a new round of solar rebates with a firm deadline to be installed and operational by the end of June, my spreadsheet brain lit up. Between the tax credit, the state rebate, and the long-term energy savings, the math was too good to ignore. Those rebates did not care about association politics. They just cared about the date stamped on the final inspection. So I did what the rules told me to do. I found a reputable installer. They produced a full proposal, panel layout, structural report, electrical plan. I printed everything and filled out the architectural change request form from the association website. I attached the proposal, a color rendering of the panels on my roof, and a copy of the rebate pre-approval that showed a June 30th expiration date. The first evidence prop in this whole saga sat in my hands that morning, my architectural request packet, stamped received April 30th in red ink by the association office. The date mattered because the guidelines promised that the committee would respond within 30 days of receiving a complete application. That meant I would have an answer by May 30th at the latest. I scheduled installation for June 3rd. That gave a small cushion before the rebate deadline and respected their 30-day window. On paper, everything lined up. In reality, I had underestimated how much the board loved control and hated being forced to follow their own timelines. When I dropped my packet off, Ms. L was in the office, which was really just a repurposed room in the small clubhouse near the pool. The air conditioning hummed softly against the already warming spring air as she looked up from her laptop. I laid my packet on the desk, pointed to the stamp date, and reminded her that the deadlines were tight for the contractor and the state incentive. She nodded with the kind of practiced calm you hear from someone who is already rehearsing how they will deny you later. I walked out of the clubhouse feeling cautiously optimistic, unaware that the silence that followed would be a tactic, not an accident. The first week after I submitted the packet was quiet. Too quiet. I kept an eye on my email and my mailbox. The only communication I got from the association was a generic notice about the upcoming pool opening. The days started to slide by, one after another, as the weather shifted from pleasant to genuinely hot. A soft whir from backyard ceiling fans became the soundtrack to the evenings as people tried to stay outside a little longer before going back into their cooled homes. By the second week, I started checking the online portal just in case they had posted a decision there. Nothing. No updates, no questions, no preliminary feedback. The architectural guidelines said the committee could ask for additional information, but no one reached out. The silence felt less like bureaucracy and more like strategy. Meanwhile, the corner Karen had apparently picked up gossip from someone on the committee. She started staring at my roofline every time she walked her small dog past my house. I would be pulling weeds or rolling my trash bin back from the curb, and I could feel her eyes tracing the angles of my shingles as if she already saw the panels bolted up there. A few days later, I got a different kind of notice from the board. It was not about solar. It was a friendly reminder that my trash bin needed to be stored behind the side gate and not visible from the street. I had forgotten to pull it in one morning after collection, and someone had taken the time to report it. The pettiness of that letter, arriving while my solar application sat untouched, felt deliberate. It was a reminder of who was in charge, a nudge that they were watching everything except the one request I needed them to act on. As the third week approached, I pulled out my copy of the covenants again. I flipped to the sections about architectural approvals and saw the line I had missed before: if the board failed to respond within 30 days, the application would be considered approved by default. It was a small clause, tucked into the middle of a dry paragraph, but it was there. That line became my second mental evidence prop, even if it was not a physical piece of paper I could show anyone yet. It told me two things: they had a deadline too, and if they pushed past it, they would lose the control they loved. By the time May 28 rolled around, I still had nothing official. The contractor checked in with me, confirming the June 3 installation date and the plan to file for inspections right after. Their schedule was tight, and rescheduling would push my project into late summer, maybe even past the rebate deadline. Every morning, I walked out to the mailbox a little earlier than the day before. Every day, it was empty or filled with junk that did not matter. On May 29, I watched the mail truck drive past my house and stop at the corner, the hot metal of my mailbox clicking softly as it warmed up in the sun. That was the day I knew they were playing a timing game. On May 30, exactly 30 days after that red received stamp, the architectural decision finally arrived. The envelope was identical to every other piece of association mail, but I opened it on the driveway because I could not wait the 15 seconds it would take to walk inside. The letter inside was printed on standard letterhead, with the decision block smack in the center of the page where your eyes go first. My request was denied. The committee had decided that my proposed solar array did not comply with the community's desire for uniform roof aesthetics. They claimed that panels on my front-facing roof plane would be visible from the street and that this visibility violated Guideline 12C, even though that guideline only asked for reasonable placement and screening when possible. They added a line that any unapproved installation could result in fines and, if necessary, a special assessment to cover corrective action. In other words, if I installed anyway, they would hit me in the wallet. I looked at the denial letter, then back at my roof, then at the date printed at the top of the page, May 30. My installation was scheduled for June 3. The state rebate required the system to be installed and inspected by June 30. The association had used every single day of their review period before saying no, and they had done it in a way that seemed carefully designed to make me miss the financial window. The part they miscalculated was how much time I had already spent reading state law and their own documents. Hook, the board thought waiting until day 30 would quietly kill my rebate and force me to give up, but all they really did was start a countdown that would show whether their love of control was stronger than my right to use my own roof. When I calmed down enough to read the denial letter a second time, the patterns jumped out like they had been highlighted. The committee quoted Guideline 12C as if it banned anything visible from the street, but the actual guideline only talked about reasonable efforts to minimize visibility. They also added a sentence that did not exist anywhere in the printed architectural guidelines, a claim that solar equipment on front roof planes is discouraged in all circumstances. Discouraged was not the same as prohibited, but they dressed it up like a hard rule. I set the letter on my dining table next to my original packet and opened the binder where I kept all the association documents. I had printed everything when I moved in because I never trusted uploaded PDFs to stay where they were supposed to. There it was, Guideline 12C, in black and white, with no mention of an outright ban. The denial letter was not applying the rule, it was rewriting it. What the board also failed to mention in their letter was something much bigger than their own guidelines. In our state, we have a solar access statute that protects homeowners from unreasonable restrictions on rooftop solar. I had looked it up when I first started this project, more out of curiosity than concern. Now it looked a lot less theoretical. That law said, in plain language, that associations could not prevent homeowners from installing solar energy systems as long as the installations complied with building codes and did not impose unreasonable aesthetic restrictions that made the systems ineffective or more expensive. It did not say associations got to slow-walk approvals until rebates expired. I printed the statute that night and slid it into a sheet protector, another evidence prop in a growing pile that the board did not know existed yet. In the quiet of my kitchen, the fridge motor buzzed faintly behind me as I started mapping out my options. Doing nothing was mathematically impossible. If I accepted the denial and cancelled my installation, I would lose the state rebate and miss out on thousands of dollars in long-term savings. Installing without approval would trigger fines and maybe that special assessment they had hinted at. Fighting them head-on in court would cost time I did not have before June 30th. What was left was the narrow path in the middle, pushing back within their own system, using their own documents and the state law they pretended did not exist. They wanted a neat file with my name on it sitting quietly in a drawer. Instead, I was going to give them something messier, and I was going to do it on their timeline, not mine. The first step was to document everything. I copied the denial letter, keeping the original in a folder labeled Solar Evidence. I pulled my stamped architectural request form and added it to the same folder, the red April 30th date facing outward. I printed the solar access statute and highlighted the paragraph that talked about unreasonable restrictions on location and cost. Then I sat down and drafted a response to the committee. I did not threaten anyone. I did not raise my voice. I summarized their denial, pointed out how their interpretation of Guideline 12C differed from the printed version, and gently reminded them of the state statute that limited their ability to block rooftop solar without a legitimate reason. I noted that my installer had confirmed the front roof plane was the optimal location for production and cost, and that moving the panels to the back would require extra equipment and reduce output. I ended by requesting a reconsideration of their decision or, at the very least, a written explanation of how their denial complied with the solar access law. I submitted that response through the online portal and dropped a hard copy at the clubhouse door, sliding it through the mail slot because the office was closed by the time I got there. The slot made a small metallic scrape as the envelope passed through and landed on the other side, a tiny sound that felt more satisfying than it should have. Outside, a thin line of clouds dulled the afternoon glare as I walked back to my car. I knew the committee would not be pleased that I cited state law to them. People who enjoy power do not enjoy being reminded of the limits on that power. The next few days were a blur of almosts. My installer checked in again, asking if I had heard anything decisive. I told them I was waiting on the board but still wanted to hold the June 3rd date for now. They warned me that moving the date would push me to late June, right up against the rebate deadline, and that the inspector backlog might make things tight. Meanwhile, the corner Karen's behavior shifted from curious to smug. She lingered in front of my house a little longer during her walks, eyes tracing my roofline as if she was already satisfied nothing would change up there. I saw her chatting animatedly with Miss L in front of the clubhouse one morning, both of them glancing in my direction. Then the association portal updated. The status on my architectural request changed from denied to under review, appeal. It was a tiny concession, a digital shrug that said they had at least read my response. The system noted that appeals could take up to 15 days. 15 days I did not have. By now, it was June 1st. The installation was 2 days away. The rebate clock was ticking louder in my head than any physical sound in my house. I was living inside a low-level conflict that was starting to rise, not in one explosive moment, but in the slow, steady way a pot of water reaches a boil. The board was not shouting. They were doing something worse, knowing I was under a hard deadline and pretending their own soft deadlines were more important. The hum of distant lawnmowers drifted through the closed windows as the first real escalation landed in my mailbox. The new letter was titled Final Notice, Architectural Denial. It acknowledged my appeal but claimed that the committee's original decision stood. They said front-facing solar panels were inconsistent with the community's established visual character, and that my insistence on using that roof plane was unreasonable when other surfaces were available. They did not mention the solar access statute at all. This time, the letter was dated June 2nd and included something new, a detailed schedule of fines that could be imposed if I proceeded with the installation without explicit written approval. Daily fines for non-compliance, administrative fees for each violation notice, and a statement that, if unpaid, the amounts could be converted into a special assessment attached to my account. They were no longer hinting. They were threatening. I spread the new letter out on my dining table next to the first denial, the stamped application, and the printed statute. The stack was starting to look less like routine paperwork and more like a case file. The temperature outside climbed into the high 80s. Inside, the air felt colder than the thermostat setting. Hook, the board had turned my rooftop into a financial battlefield, and now it was not just the rebate at risk, it was the threat of thousands in fines and a special assessment hanging over my house if I dared to use my own roof. The timing of the final notice was not an accident. The letter was dated June 2nd, the day before my scheduled installation, but it had been mailed standard postage. That meant they had decided to double down at the last possible moment, hoping fear would do what their guidelines could not. I called the installer and laid out the situation. They had seen association pushback before, but even they were surprised by the explicit threat of a special assessment. We agreed to postpone the June 3rd installation to late June, keeping a slim chance at the rebate alive while I tried to pry an actual, lawful decision out of the committee. It was a tactical retreat, but it felt like a loss. In the association office, the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to feel oppressive when I walked in for the next board meeting. The notice for that meeting had been my third major evidence prop. A board agenda excerpt, slipped into the monthly newsletter, listed an item under new business, discussion, solar panel policy clarification. No names, no specifics, just a vague line that meant my appeal had turned into a policy fight. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the second row of folding chairs. A handful of neighbors filtered in, mostly the regulars. The board members took their places at the front table, their printed agenda packets neatly stacked, glasses of water sweating onto coasters. They moved through the routine items first, minutes, financials, landscaping updates. Then they reached new business. When they hit the solar policy item, the temperature in the room might as well have shifted, not because of anything said, but because all eyes flicked briefly toward me. The board discussed how recent events had highlighted gaps in the existing guidelines. They talked about preserving uniformity, maintaining property values, and avoiding visual clutter on the neighborhood's rooflines. They emphasized their authority to interpret the guidelines and suggested that a more explicit restriction on front-facing solar might be necessary. No one mentioned the solar access statute. No one acknowledged that my application had been submitted before any new policy was even proposed. At this point, the board had denied my solar request on day 30, threatened fines and a special assessment if I installed, and rushed to rewrite the rules in a public meeting without mentioning the state law that limited their power. The rebate deadline was creeping closer, and each move they made was designed to run out the clock and force me to choose between saving money and surrendering control of my own roof. After the meeting, neighbors drifted toward the door in small clusters. I caught snippets of their reactions without hearing exact words. Some worried about their own rights, some repeating the board's talking points, a few looking at me with awkward sympathy. The corner Karen moved straight to Ms. L at the front of the room, gesturing animatedly back toward where I had been sitting. That night, I added the board agenda excerpt to my evidence folder, highlighting the line about policy clarification. I was no longer just dealing with an unfair denial. I was watching a group of volunteers try to rewrite the rules in real time to justify what they had already done. It was time to turn this from a one-sided escalation into something that pushed back. That night, the cicadas rasped in the humid darkness outside my window as I spread my papers across the dining table like a battlefield map. I had my stamped application from April 30th, the original denial dated May 30th, the final notice dated June 2nd, the printed text of Guideline 12C, the board agenda excerpt, and the solar access statute. I realized I was not just frustrated, I was the only person in the room who had lined all of those documents up in chronological order and seen the pattern. The board had used every day of their 30-day window, ignored a state law, threatened financial penalties, and then rushed to discuss policy clarification only after I objected. They were not enforcing rules, they were improvising power. I never set out to create an HOA revenge story, but the committee had backed me into a corner where quiet compliance was no longer an option. I grabbed a notebook and started outlining my own plan. I was not going to corner them with anger. I was going to corner them with their own paper trail. If the board wanted to keep their control intact, they were about to face something they hated even more than solar panels: the slow, public embarrassment of being forced to follow their own rules in front of the same neighbors they had tried to impress. The first step in my retaliation was simple: make sure someone with more authority than the board knew what they were doing. I reached out to the state's Consumer Energy Office, not for formal legal advice, but to ask general questions about how the solar access statute applied to association restrictions. I sent them scans of my denial letters, the relevant guideline pages, and the highlighted statute. I was careful not to demand a specific outcome. I just asked whether an association could delay approvals until rebates expired and whether banning front-facing solar panels outright would be considered reasonable under the law. A few days later, I got a written response. It was cautious, but one line stood out: while they could not intervene directly in private association disputes, they confirmed that state law generally did not allow restrictions that made solar installations significantly less effective or more expensive without a compelling reason. They also noted that association policies had to be consistent with state statutes and could not be retroactively applied to deny previously submitted applications. I printed that email and filed it under solar evidence, another piece of quiet ammunition. It did not solve everything, but it backed up what I already suspected. Next, I went back to the association documents and found a clause I had skimmed before, a statement in the covenants that the board must comply with all applicable state and local laws, and that no rule or guideline could contradict those laws. It was a single paragraph, but in the context of the solar access statute, it turned into a lever. I highlighted that paragraph and added it to my folder, underlining the part about conflicting rules being unenforceable. From there, I crafted my next move. I prepared a revised architectural submission, not because I accepted their reasoning, but because I wanted to close every loophole they could claim to hide behind. Working with my installer, I adjusted the layout so that a portion of the array was shifted toward the rear planes where it was still structurally sound, while keeping enough panels on the more productive front slope to make the system viable. We included a technical note explaining how moving everything to the back would reduce production by a specific percentage and require additional hardware, increasing cost. I bundled that revised layout with a cover letter that did three things. First, it acknowledged their concerns about uniformity and explained how the new layout minimized visibility while preserving system performance. Second, it cited the solar access statute and the clause in our covenants requiring compliance with state law. Third, it politely asked the board to confirm, in writing, whether they believed their denial and any potential fines were consistent with those provisions. I ended the letter by stating that, absent a lawful objection, I intended to proceed with installation before the rebate deadline. I submitted the revised packet both through the portal and as a hard copy, time-stamped at the clubhouse office. This time, when I handed it over, the part-time staff member at the desk glanced at the growing thickness of my file and gave me a sympathetic look. This was no longer just a simple request. It was a record. The board did not respond to my revised packet right away, of course. Silence is one of their favorite tactics, and they use it the way some people use high fences, as both a barrier and a message. For a few days, nothing changed in the portal. My application sat there, status unchanged, while the summer heat settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket. The whir of my air conditioner filled the evenings, a quiet reminder of why I wanted those panels on my roof in the first place. Then the association's next move arrived, not as a letter this time, but as something more subtle. They updated the architectural guidelines on the website. The PDF that had been static for years suddenly had a new revision date in the corner. When I opened it, Guideline 12C had sprouted extra paragraphs. The new language talked about strong discouragement of front-facing solar equipment, recommended placement solely on rear or side roof planes whenever physically possible, and referenced recent community feedback about preserving uniform appearances. It was carefully worded, but there was no mistaking the intent. They were trying to rewrite the rules mid-game. Buried at the bottom of the guideline, in small text, was a line that almost smelled like guilt. These clarifications apply prospectively to new applications submitted after the revision date. On paper, at least, they admitted they could not retroactively apply the new language to older applications like mine. In practice, I knew they would still try. I printed that updated guideline and slid it into my evidence folder behind the original version, the 2 pages back to back in the same plastic sleeve. The visual contrast between them said more than any angry email ever could. The next escalation came wrapped in polite language that felt like it had been polished for hours under fluorescent lights. I received an email from the association office saying the committee had questions about my revised proposal and wanted me to attend a special architectural review session. The tone was all courtesy and mutual understanding, but the subtext was obvious. They wanted me in a room where they could push back, off the record, away from the neat emails and printed statutes I kept collecting. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the small clubhouse conference room. The sun was still bright when I walked in, casting long rectangles of light across the cheap carpet. The ceiling fan made a soft ticking noise as it turned, a mechanical heartbeat over the low murmur of board members settling into their seats. 3 committee members were present: Ms. L, the board president, Mr. D, the treasurer, and another director who usually stayed quiet at meetings. They had copies of my revised layout in front of them, along with a fresh stack of guidelines printed on bright white paper. They started with small talk about neighborhood events, then pivoted to the matter at hand. They did not like the visibility of the panels that would still be on my front roof plane. They suggested moving the entire array to the rear, downplaying the cost increase and performance loss as minor. They expressed concern that approving my layout would set a precedent for other homeowners to install visible panels, changing the community's look. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of anything. I listened, then calmly walked them through the evidence I had brought in a simple folder. I laid out the original Guideline 12C and the revised version side by side, the older one facing up with no mention of absolute bans. I pointed out the line at the bottom of the new page stating it applied only to applications submitted after the revision date. I reminded them my original application had been filed weeks earlier, on April 30th, and stamped received by their own office. Then I referenced the solar access statute, the printed one in my folder with the key paragraph highlighted. I explained, in plain terms, that moving the entire system to the rear would both reduce production and add cost, according to my installer's written calculations, which I had also included in the packet. I reminded them that the state law did not allow restrictions that made systems significantly less effective or more expensive without a valid justification. Finally, I pointed to the clause in our covenants that required the board to comply with state law and rendered any conflicting rules unenforceable. Arihook, I did not threaten lawsuits or shout about rights. Instead, I laid out a clear path where their continued refusal could evolve from an annoying HOA quarrel into a documented pattern of ignoring state law that might attract attention they really did not want. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the distant slap of pool water from outside. Ms. L's expression tightened. She asked, in broad terms, whether I was prepared to escalate this beyond the community. I told her I had already sought general guidance from the state's Consumer Energy Office, and that I was keeping careful records of the dates, decisions, and policy changes. I emphasized that I still preferred a cooperative solution that respected both the community's aesthetics and my rights as a homeowner. She did not like that answer, but she heard it. Before leaving, I asked one more thing, that they provide their final position in writing, referencing the specific guidelines and statutes they believed supported it. I did not need them to like my request. I just needed them to commit to something they could not later pretend they never said. Days later, on a heavy, overcast afternoon when the sky looked more like steel than air, the board finally blinked. An envelope arrived labeled Architectural Appeal Decision, Supplemental. Inside, the letter was longer than usual, as if someone had tried to bury the important part under extra paragraphs. It restated their desire to limit front-facing equipment, referenced the newly revised Guideline 12C, and talked in circles about community standards and property values. And then, in the middle of the second page, there it was. The committee acknowledged that my original application predated the revised guideline. They conceded that state law limited their ability to impose restrictions that significantly increased cost or decreased performance of solar installations. They said that, in light of these factors, they were issuing a conditional approval of my revised layout. The conditions were small and mostly cosmetic: matching frame color, minimizing gap spacing, painting conduit to match the roof where allowed by electrical code. The core of my layout remained intact, including the critical panels on the more productive front slope. They had backed down without ever saying the words we were both thinking. They had lost. I read that paragraph twice, then a third time. It was not dramatic. There were no fireworks or shouting matches. It was just quiet compliance, written in bureaucratic language that could be filed away by anyone not paying close attention. But I was paying attention. This was the apex of the story, not because I destroyed the board or overturned all their rules, but because I forced a group of people who loved control to stand in the narrow space between their preferences and the law and choose which one mattered more. The revenge here was not explosive. It was structural. As soon as the conditional approval letter was in my hands, I forwarded a scanned copy to my installer. They rearranged their schedule and slotted me into a mid-June installation window. It was later than the original June 3rd date, but still early enough to get through inspection before the June 30th rebate deadline if nothing else went wrong. I also did something the board did not expect. I went back to the association portal and, using the feature they had installed for community education, submitted a short, calm summary of the state's solar access protections and how they worked alongside our covenants. I did not mention my case by name. I did not accuse the board of anything. I just explained that homeowners had certain rights under state law and that any new solar policies had to respect those laws. The post was approved and published because, on paper, there was nothing objectionable about it. It was just information. By the time my panels were ready to go up, the board was facing something they could not threaten with fines: a slow shift in the neighborhood where more homeowners knew they did not have to accept every preference disguised as a rule. Installation day finally came on a bright, blinding morning when the sun felt almost personal. The sound of drilling and footsteps on my roof echoed down into the house, rattling picture frames and sending faint vibrations through the walls. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed. A few stopped on the sidewalk to watch. The corner Karen walked by twice that day, her gaze fixed on the crew like she was watching a trespasser. She had to know about the conditional approval by then. People talk, and I am sure she had been asking questions. But there was nothing she could do. The board had signed off. The crew finished the installation in 2 days. The panels sat on my roofline like dark glass tiles, angled toward the same sun that had torched my utility bills for years. The front array was neat, symmetrical, and visible from the street, exactly what the board had tried to avoid. The inspector came out the following week. The morning was hot and still, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots as he walked around the house. He checked the mounting, wiring, and shut-off labels, nodded a few times, and left with a simple promise: the paperwork would be filed within a couple of days. When the final sign-off came through, it was dated June 26th. 4 days before the rebate deadline. After everything, the victory did not feel like fireworks. It felt like the quiet click of a lock as a door closed behind me, separating the two halves of my relationship with the association, before the solar fight and after. In the weeks that followed, the tangible benefits started to show up as numbers. My utility bills dropped. The monitoring app showed my system soaking up sunlight while my air conditioner hummed. The same sun that had once felt like an enemy on high-bill months was finally working for me. But the real aftermath was not just about money. It was about how the neighborhood changed, inch by inch. My panels became a conversation starter. Neighbors who had watched the drama from the sidelines began asking what it had taken to get them approved. I shared broad strokes, not to stir up trouble, but to make sure people knew they did not have to abandon improvements just because someone on a committee frowned at them. Within a year, 2 more houses on my street submitted their own solar applications. This time, the board's responses were quicker and cleaner. The new Guideline 12C was still there, with its cautious language about placement, but the denials were gone. Conditional approvals became standard, and the conditions stayed in the realm of aesthetics rather than hidden roadblocks. The association even tried to spin this shift as a green initiative in the newsletter, framing it as evidence of their forward-thinking leadership. Anyone who had watched what happened knew the truth. They had not championed renewable energy, they had been dragged toward it by a homeowner who refused to roll over. To me, that is where the heart of this story lives. It is not in some explosive meeting or a public ousting of the board. It is in the slow, stubborn insistence that rules should mean something and that power has limits, even in a place where a handful of people think they control every mailbox color, and roofline. If this sounds like a Karen neighbor drama from the outside, I get it. There were definitely moments when it felt like I was starring in an HOA versus homeowner episode that no one had asked for. But what happened here was bigger than one argument. It was about drawing a line around my home and refusing to let someone else redraw it for their comfort. Living under an association means accepting some compromises, but it does not mean surrendering your autonomy every time a rule is waved in your direction. A good board protects the community. A bad one treats every home like a stage where they can act out their personal preferences. When that happens, the most effective, satisfying revenge story is often the one where you quietly force them back inside the boundaries they forgot applied to them too. These days, when the late afternoon light hits the street just right, you can see 3 different roofs with their own sets of panels catching the sun. The uniform beige has been interrupted by a few dark rectangles that reflect the sky. It is a small change, but in a place obsessed with sameness, it feels huge. The corner Karen still walks past my house, of course. She glances up at the panels every time, her expression difficult to read. Maybe she still hates them. Maybe she has made peace with them. Maybe she knows that, somewhere in a file cabinet with my name on it, there is a stack of documents proving how close the board came to overreaching in a way that could have cost them more than my goodwill. I did not get anyone removed from the board. I did not burn the system down. What I did was worse, at least from their perspective. I created a paper trail, leveraged their own covenants, used a state statute they had pretended not to see, and turned what could have been just another HOA nightmare into a slow-burn HOA revenge story where the ending was not explosive but deeply, quietly satisfying. In the end, my roof did not just become a power plant. It became proof that you can push back against petty control without losing your mind or your savings, as long as you are willing to be as methodical as the people who count on you giving up. Tell me your worst HOA versus my home improvement horror in one line.